that attach the upper extremity, the arm, to the axial skeleton. So they essentially cross the shoulder joint. So they're going to be involved in maintaining the shoulder joint in place, and also helping the arm do abduction, adduction, flexion, and extension at the shoulder joint, and circumduction. So the largest muscle in the anterior chest is the Pectoralis Major, and its origin is the ribs, the sternum, and the clavicle. Its insertion is on the lip of the bicipital groove. So its action is to help, is to move the shoulder in a medial rotation pattern and in flexion. If we remove the Pectoralis Major, we have a small muscle that underlies it on the deep side here, which is the Pectoralis Minor. It originates on ribs 3 through 5. Its insertion is the coracoid process, and so it's this muscle right here, the Pectoralis Minor. Now, if we look posterior, then we'll see that I have muscles that are also involved in keeping the scapula and the shoulder in place. And so the first muscle as we go posterior is a muscle on the lateral wall, and it has origins on all of the ribs, and that gives it a serrated appearance. So it's called the Serratus Anterior. So if we look on this side, we can actually see that it has a serrated edge as we see it in place. It crosses the shoulder and attaches to the anterior aspect of the vertebral border of the scapula. So posterior, we have a very large muscle, which is the trapezius. And the trapezius originates on the clavicle, the acromion process, and the scapular spine, inserts on those. Its origin is the vertebral border of the vertebral spines. And so we divide it into 3 parts: an upper trap, which attaches to the skull at the neutral lines, a middle trap, and an inferior trap. And so when we have a complex muscle like this, if you look at fiber directions, then each of these does a different action, which is why the trap has quite a bit of variation in the actions that it creates. And so always remember that fibers shorten toward an origin, and you can make sense out of that. If we remove the trapezius, then underlying it we can see muscles that attach to that, whose insertion is the vertebral border of the scapula, and whose origin is the lower cervical and upper thoracic spines. And it runs so that it looks kind of like a diamond that you'd see on a card deck, so hence its name, rhomboids. And so it's the rhomboideus major, which is the lower larger muscle, and then the rhomboideus minor, which is the upper smaller muscle. And since this is the insertion, it would tend to abduct or retract the scapula. Coming off the superior angle of the scapula as an insertion and going to cervical vertebrae is a muscle that elevates the scapula, as in shrugging the shoulders, and so we call it the levator scapulae. Now as we move lateral, a superficial muscle that comes off of the clavicle, acromion process, and scapular spine as an origin runs to the deltoid tuberosity as an insertion is the deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle, like the trapezius muscle, is divided into parts. So we have an anterior deltoid here, a middle deltoid here, and as we look posterior, a posterior deltoid. So again, since these fibers are at slightly different angles, they provide the deltoid a fairly wide range of actions. So if we look at our deltoid, then we have a very broad muscle that comes across the back, and its name is latissimus, which means the widest muscle in the group. So its origins are the thoracic spines through lumbar spines through the sacrum. and it crosses the shoulder joint in the armpit and attaches to the lip of the bicipital groove, and so it's called the Latissimus Dorsi because its widest part is posterior on the body. So if we begin to look at some smaller muscles that are associated with the scapula, we can look in a window between the deltoid and the Latissimus Dorsi, and we can see two muscles here running off of the scapula toward the humerus. So the lower muscle is the larger muscle, which is the teres minor. The upper muscle is a smaller muscle, which is the, teres. The lower muscle is a larger muscle called the teres major, and the upper muscle is a smaller muscle called the teres minor. Now, if we remove the Latissimus dorsi and we remove and we abduct the arm, then we can see those muscles in a different angle. So this lower muscle is the teres major, and then this upper muscle right here is the teres minor. Now, associated with the scapula, we have muscles that we find above the scapular spine and below the scapular spine. And the muscle above the scapular spine is called the supraspinatus muscle. The muscle below the scapular spine is called the infraspinatus muscle. And so the teres minor, the infraspinatus, and the supraspinatus are three muscles that make up a group of muscles that keep the head of the humerus in the socket in the shoulder, so they're called rotator cuff muscles. So with this arm model, I can actually disengage the arm. So what we can see is on the anterior aspect of the scapula, we have a muscle that sits in a depression in the scapula. So the depression we learned was the subscapular fossa. So the muscle that sits in it is the subscapularis. It is the fourth muscle that makes up the rotator cuff. So on this model we can see why these muscles make up the rotator cuff. So we can actually see the teres minor attaching to the head of the humerus, the infraspinatus attaching to the head of the humerus, the supraspinatus attaching to the head of the humerus, and the subscapularis attaching to the head of the humerus. So they create a tendon that goes all the way around the head, hence the name rotator cuff. The last muscle that is involved in maintaining the clavicle scapula relative to muscles that contract against it is a small muscle that we find just beneath the clavicle, and it stabilizes the clavicle, so it's called the Subclavius Muscle that we see right here. We're going to look at muscles that arise on the scapula clavicle, and they insert on the brachium much lower than the muscles we've just been talking about. And so the first one is a small muscle in the armpit region. Its origin is the coracoid process. Its insertion is on the medial aspect of the humerus, and so it's kind of a general origin insertion named muscle, the coracobrachialis. Now, we have two muscles that act together to flex the forearm. The largest muscle, which is superficial, is the Biceps Brachii. It gets its name biceps because it has two heads. So its short head is seen here on the coracoid process. Its long head is not quite visible, but it crosses through the humerus here and attaches to the upper lip of the glenoid fossa. So it's this tendon we're seeing right here. Its insertion is on the radial tuberosity. Deep to it is a muscle we can see laterally on the arm, which is the brachialis. Its origin is about midway down the humerus, and then its insertion is on the ulna. So with the brachialis and the radiobrachialis, we are attaching to both the radius and humerus for forearm flexion. In the posterior compartment for the upper arm, we have a muscle that actually has three parts to it. This part, this part, and this part. So we divide it into the lateral head, the long head, and the medial head. And so since it has three parts, it's called the Triceps Brachii, and its insertion is on the olecranon process of the ulna. So it has an opposite action as the two we just did, which would be extension of the arm. Now, if we look in the elbow region and we remove some superficial muscles, then we have two muscles that allow us to either pronate or supinate our arm. So the superficial muscle we can see right here is the Pronator Teres, and it pronates the arm. So its origin is on the humerus. Its insertion here is on the radius. Its fibers run at an angle so that when the fibers shorten, it rotates the radius around. The muscle that has an opposite action is this muscle right here, which is the supinator, and its fibers run in exactly opposite directions. Its origin again is on the humerus, its insertion is on the radius, and because the fibers are at an opposite action, it rotates the radius in a different direction and supinates the arm. So when we look at the forearm, if we start with the anterior aspect of the forearm, then we have muscles that are involved in flexion of the forearm. So we have a very large muscle that we see that makes the ridge on your arm here, which is the brachioradialis, again coming off the humerus, going to the radius. And so we have brachioradialis here. As we rotate the arm, we actually have muscles that attach at the carpals. And because they attach at the carpals, they flex the wrist. So they're going to incorporate the word carpi in their name. And then because they're flexors, we can refer to them by their action, flexion. And then we use the bones they're associated with to help define them. So on the little finger side of the arm, we have a flexor carpi ulnaris, because the ulna is the bone on this side of your arm. Note that its tendon comes to the anterior aspect of the carpals here. And then on the opposite side of the arm, we have the flexor carpi radialis, whose tendons are also going to the carpals. So both of these muscles flex the forearm. In between these two muscles, we have a superficial muscle whose tendon stops in the palm region of the hand. So the in-between muscle is the palmaris longus. As we turn the arm posterior, then the muscles on the posterior compartment of the arm are actually going to extend the wrist. So since their tendons are going to attach to the wrist, then we will call them flexor carpi muscles again. And then again, we're going to associate the muscle with one of the forearm bones. So recall that the little finger side is where the ulna is. So this muscle here, whose tendon attaches to the wrist by the little finger, it's going to be the extensor carpi ulnaris. So note that if we look at the side of the arm, we have the flexor carpi ulnaris on the anterior aspect of the arm, and immediately posterior to it we have the extensor carpi ulnaris. So if we look at the flexor carpi radialis again, the connection isn't as clear as what we just saw. We have brachioradialis in between, and if we look lateral to brachioradialis, then we have two muscles here. This one is a longer muscle, so it's called the flexor carpi radialis longus. And then the one that sits next to it, which is on your list, would be the flexor carpi radialis brevis.